They called her the night janitor. Dr. Mercer introduced it during morning rounds, pausing for the residents to chuckle before moving on to the next patient file. His voice carried the texture of a man accustomed to laughter following him like a small dog. Sarah Chen stood 3 feet away, adjusting before on bed 4, her hand steady as surgical lasers, and she didn't flinch. She didn't acknowledge. She adjusted the flow rate from 125 to 140 milliliters per hour and moved to the next patient without breaking rhythm. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above St. Michael's 3rd floor. Norfolk humidity pressed against the windows like something alive. It was 0430, that hollow part of the night shift when the hospital belonged to the dying and the nurses who kept them breathing. Sarah had been walking these corridors for 7 years, longer than Dr. Mercer had been attending, longer than he'd been anything except bitter about a woman who commanded respect he couldn't purchase with credentials. The surgeons asked for her by name. Not by request. By insistence. Dr. Harrison, who'd trained at Johns Hopkins 28 years ago, had pulled her aside on her 3rd week. Who taught you to play central lines? She'd answered, practice, which was technically true if you counted field hospitals in places the Pentagon still wouldn't name. Dr. Okonkwo, the trauma chief, called her for vascular access on the difficult bleeds, the ones where veins had already been burned through by previous attempts, where time was hemorrhage counting down. She'd established a 4-finger technique that the other nurses couldn't replicate, a method of angling the needle that seemed to have its own geometry, its own gravity. Okonkwo watched her work once and never questioned it again. Just moved on. Just trusted it would work. This was precisely what made Dr. Mercer's stomach curdle every single morning. He was Ivy League. Brown undergraduate, Harvard Medical School, a residency at Massachusetts General that he mentioned approximately 17 times per shift. His own hand shook sometimes during procedures. Not visibly to the residents, but Sarah saw. She saw everything. She saw him double-check his own work, saw him request confirmation from nurses half his experience. She saw him watch her move through a crisis, the Foley catheter placement, the rapid blood draw, the EKG lead positioning, and she saw him realize that whatever he'd paid for hadn't given him what she had. Competence born from something deeper than textbooks. Authority that didn't require a voice. Sarah moved through St. Michael's at night with the posture of someone whose weight was always centered. Shoulders squared. Feet placed with precision that suggested the ground beneath her might shift at any moment. The night shift suited her. Fewer administrators wandering the halls. Fewer opportunities for people to ask questions. She kept a single dog tag on a broken chain tucked inside her scrub pocket. The chain slipped through a safety pin so it wouldn't clink against the stethoscope or badge reel. No one knew it was there. No one asked about the faint calloused ridge on her left palm where a rifle had burned her skin during a live-fire drill in 2012. No one noticed that she could intubate an airway in 30 seconds flat in pitch darkness because she'd done it that way before, in terrain where light meant death. They didn't know what she was. They didn't know who taught her to move like that, or why her hands never wavered when they pressed against human ribs or when she aspirated fluid from distended bellies. They saw a night shift nurse. Competent. Quiet. Deferential. A woman who said of course, doctor, and stepped aside for the men in ties. A woman safe to ignore. The combat medic arrived at 0447, a former Army specialist named Clayton who transferred to St. Michael's ER 3 weeks prior. He was running trauma intake when Sarah came down with a post-op patient bleeding into his fascia, a straightforward evacuation, nothing critical, but the vein had retracted. Most nurses would have escalated it, called for a resident, waited. Sarah had approached with her materials arranged, 2 14-gauge angiocaths, saline flushes, gauze pre-cut into strips she'd prepared during her break. She'd located the vein by feel, literally by the pressure of her fingertips against the swollen tissue, and threaded the first needle with a precision that didn't belong in the real world. Clayton had frozen mid-suture. His hand stopped moving. His eyes tracked hers as she advanced the catheter, aspirated blood, flushed the line. It took 14 seconds. The blood began draining immediately, the pressure releasing, the patient's color returning from gray to something approximating human. Sarah had stepped back, documented the procedure, and continued with post-op assessment. Routine. Clinical. Finished. But Clayton couldn't move. He stood there with the patient's abdominal wall still open under the OR lights, his suture half completed, his eyes locked on the forefinger position her hands had assumed. Thumb underneath. Index and middle fingers bracketing the vessel on top. Ring finger stabilizing the approach angle. Pinky extended for balance. It was unorthodox. It shouldn't have worked. It worked perfectly every single time. He'd caught her arm as she was leaving the OR. Quietly. Just his fingers on her sleeve, the lightest pressure, like he was afraid she might dissolve if he gripped too hard. "I've only seen that technique once," he'd whispered. His voice had the texture of someone standing in a memory. Bagram. 2011, under mortar fire. Combat Support Hospital. There was a nurse. He'd stopped. He'd looked at her face. Really looked at her. Never mind. Sarah hadn't broken stride. She'd pulled her arm back with the slightest motion, gentle and final, and continued down the hallway to finish her notes. But she'd felt something crack inside her chest. Not fear. Not recognition. Something older. Something that lived in the scar tissue. The memories waited for her like patient predators. They always did. But they knew better than to attack during a shift. During shifts, she was someone else. Someone careful. Someone small. She'd trained herself for 7 years to make her voice softer, to stand with shoulders slightly rounded, to accept dismissal without the kind of eye contact that made people uncomfortable. She'd learned to become invisible to everyone except the ones who mattered, the patients. The dying. The ones who couldn't be saved by credentials or confidence or the weight of an Ivy League name. But at shift end, when the fluorescent lights faded and the parking lot turned into something resembling stillness, the cracks widened. It was 0630 when Sarah pulled the dog tag from her pocket for the ritual. The broken chain was cold. The metal itself bore the wear of 7 years in a scrub pocket, burnished and faint, the edges softened by the movement of her hand reaching for it during her breaks, during the moments between traumas when she could step away and remember who she used to be. The name etched on it faced inward, toward her chest, hidden the way she'd hidden everything else. She'd walked away from that name on a day when the blood wouldn't stop running, when her spotter had bled out in her arms despite her hands being exactly where they needed to be, despite her knowing everything she was supposed to know. Pain is data. That's what her trainer had told her. Pain tells you what's happening to tissue. Pain is information. But the pain of holding someone and feeling them disappear, that wasn't data. That was loss. That was the moment she'd decided the call sign that had kept her alive through 3 deployments would have to become a ghost. A name whispered in valley she'd never return to. A person erased so completely that no one at St. Michael's could ever find her? She touched the dog tag once before standing, a ritual she'd repeated 6,000 times, and walked toward the parking lot where the first light was just beginning to break the Norfolk skyline. The humidity wrapped around her like a welcome enemy. Behind her, through the ER doors, she could still hear the monitors beeping their electronic heartbeats. Ahead of her waited 7 hours of the world where she was just a nurse. Competent but deferential. Skilled but powerless. A woman who did excellent work and accepted it meant nothing. She didn't see Dr. Mercer waiting near the medical staff entrance, watching her walk past with his jaw set at exactly the angle that meant he'd been thinking about how to break her all morning. The overhead page crackled at 0300 hours, cutting through the fluorescent hum of the ICU hallway. Would the night janitor please report to the ICU? The night janitor to ICU. The entire night shift heard it. Nurses glanced at Sarah, then away, the kind of sideways look you give someone drowning in slow motion. She stood at the medication cart, one hand steady on a vial of lorazepam, the other absolutely still. One measured breath. A single tear escaped before she could stop it, sliding down her left cheek like it had somewhere important to be. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with the speaker mounted in the ceiling corner, her jaw tightening just enough that the muscle flexed once, then settled. No one who looked away saw her hand drop. No one heard the breath she took when she turned toward the ICU. The patients didn't care about nicknames. Mrs. Kowalski in 412 needed her pain managed at 0330, and Sarah's hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd held broken people together in worse light than this. She changed the E4, checked the pump settings, adjusted the pillows. The woman grabbed her wrist. "You're the good one," she whispered. "The other nurses, they rush. You stay." Sarah patted her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. The night stretched on. Hours like water you could drown in slowly. Dr. Mercer found her in the supply closet at 0847, just as her shift was ending, just as her defenses were thinnest. He blocked the doorway with his body, not quite touching, but close enough that the air pressure changed. The closet smelled like bleach and industrial antiseptic, and suddenly those were the only smells in the world. His voice came out clinical, precise, the way doctors talk when they're documenting something damning. "We have medication discrepancies, Chen. Controlled substances. Your name keeps appearing in the logs at unusual times." His eyes were calm, calculating, a predator who'd done this before and knew exactly which nerve to press. "The narcotics count is short by 12 units of fentanyl over the past 3 weeks. All shifts you worked." The accusation hung there like a body in a river. "I'm documenting this formally. One more irregularity and I'll have your license reviewed by the state board. You understand? Your license. Your career." He waited for her to break. Waited for her to defend herself, to stumble, to give him something to use. Sarah absorbed each word like shrapnel absorbed into Kevlar, no visible damage, just the weight settling into her bones. She took one measured breath through her nose. Her hands, which had trembled in no operating room and no firefight, stayed absolutely still at her sides. When she spoke, her voice came out like steel wrapped in silk, sharp underneath but perfect on the surface. "When you're done performing, Dr. Mercer, there are patients who actually need care." She moved past him without waiting for a response, her shoulders never dropping, her head level. He stood frozen in the doorway, realizing too late that he'd pushed and she'd simply stepped around him like he was furniture. The look on his face was the look of a man discovering he'd been trying to move a mountain. 2 days later, at 1900 hours, the entire night crew gathered in the ambulance bay for the informal shift change ritual, 5 nurses and 2 techs standing in the Norfolk dusk, smoking and decompressing, the air cool enough to carry the salt smell of the Elizabeth River 4 blocks away. Dr. Mercer walked straight toward them, and Sarah knew immediately what this was. The way he moved, the way his jaw was set, the way he'd timed it for maximum witnesses. He raised his voice so it carried across the concrete like a sermon, effective immediately. "Nurse Chen will undergo mandatory performance monitoring due to concerns about clinical judgment. Her practice patterns have been." He paused for effect, questionable. "All her patient assignments will be reviewed by my office before documentation approval." The witnesses watched. Nurses exchanged glances. Someone's cigarette smoke drifted between them like the physical manifestation of discomfort. Sarah's jaw tightened, just once, just enough that someone standing very close might have noticed. One tear tracked down her right cheekbone. She wiped it with the back of her hand, calmly, methodically, then looked directly at Dr. Mercer and said, "Patients don't survive on your ego, doctor." Her voice was level, steady, the voice of someone stating a fact about gravity. She turned and walked to her car alone while whispers scattered behind her like startled birds. The car was a 2003 Honda Civic, 12 years old, smelling like coffee grounds and the dog tag she kept on a broken chain under her scrubs. She sat in the driver's seat for 7 minutes without starting the engine, staring at the hospital's east wing, at the light spilling from windows where people were still fighting. The dog tag was cold against her ribs, naval brass tarnished dark green from sweat and time and choices she couldn't unmake. She never took it off. It was the only thing in this life that was still true. 3 nights later, a former Army combat medic named Clayton was assisting on a complex gunshot wound repair, a penetrating GSW to the abdomen with vascular compromise, the kind of case that separated nurses from people just wearing scrubs. The patient was 32, construction supervisor, wrong place, wrong time, the same story Norfolk heard every season. Sarah was the scrubbed nurse, her hands moving from instrument to instrument in a rhythm that didn't exist in civilian medicine. Clayton watched her across the surgical field, watched her anticipate what the surgeon needed before he asked, watched her hands work. Then she executed her signature four-finger vascular clamp technique, a method so specific, so precise, that it looked like choreography translated into action. Clayton's suture hand froze mid-motion. His eyes locked on her hands. The room continued around him, but he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere in the dust and noise of Bagram airfield, listening to radio chatter in Pashto, watching a trauma medic save a Marine's life using that exact technique, those exact finger placements on the arterial clamp. He whispered it so quietly only the surgical tech heard. I've only seen one person do it that way. In Bagram. Under mortar fire. Sarah's hands never paused. The clamp held. The bleed stopped. She reached for the next instrument without acknowledging him, her face a mask of professional focus. Nothing in her changed. Clayton stared at her hands, scarred, capable, steady, and realized he was standing 3 feet away from a ghost. A ghost he wasn't supposed to know. A ghost the Pentagon had spent considerable effort making disappear. Then the page came through at 2,147 hours, and everything collapsed into the kind of crisis that separates training from muscle memory. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. A Navy SEAL had arrived by ambulance, no pulse, pupils fixed and dilated, compressions ongoing, training accident gone catastrophic, tension pneumothorax collapsing his right lung into his heart. The attending was in the OR. The resident was frozen. The paramedics were exhausted. Sarah was at the nurse's station when they burst through, barely 30 seconds between page and bedside, and she assessed the scene in one glance, no time, no resources, no attending, patient coding. She called for the thoracotomy tray without waiting for anyone's permission. The words came out like a command that had trained an entire career behind it. I'm cracking his chest. Someone get me a 36 French chest tube and a level 1 rapid infuser running, now. No please. No asking. Just orders that sounded like gravity. A surgical resident moved. A respiratory therapist moved. Clayton moved. She made the incision at the 5th intercostal space, clean and decisive, and her gloved fingers found the pericardium, found the tension, released it with a sound like air escaping from a sealed room. Then she was performing direct cardiac massage, her bare hands inside his chest cavity, her fingers compressing his heart in a rhythm she'd learned in the Hindu Kush saving Marines who'd stepped on IEDs, compressing in the pattern of rain on a metal roof, in the pattern of survival. 1, 2, 3. 90 seconds of rhythm. Then, sinus rhythm. His pulse returned like a door opening. The ER erupted in controlled chaos, intubation, pressors, blood products running wide open, the heart monitor settling into something resembling life. 3 witnesses stood frozen, Clayton, a surgical resident, and a respiratory therapist named Morrison. They watched Sarah's hands, covered now in blood that wasn't hers, her expression unchanged, and they understood in that moment that they were standing in the presence of something that didn't officially exist. She calmly delegated post-resuscitation care, get him to ICU on 3 pressors, continuous cardiac monitoring, I want echo and CT chest, and walked to the scrub sink like she'd just finished a routine case. Dr. Mercer arrived 10 minutes later. He reviewed the scene, looked at the charts, saw the witnesses, and his face went absolutely cold. He'd pushed a nurse 3 times and been refused each time. Now he was looking at evidence that she'd performed an open cardiac massage that had brought a dead man back to life. He pulled the respiratory therapist into a supply closet. That never happened. You understand me? You were assisting in the psycho, not the trauma bay. Scheduling optimization transfers effective immediately. The resident got transferred to the overnight clinic. Clayton got reassigned to the surgical floors. Witnesses scattered like ash. Dr. Mercer altered the incident report to omit the patient's code status, made the documentation look like an unauthorized procedure, a violation of protocols, a nurse practicing medicine without a license. He restricted Sarah's access to medical files. His attorney brother, 3 states away, was already drafting the termination paperwork. The SEAL was transferred to critical care, stable, alive, his heart beating inside his reconstructed chest because of hands that didn't officially belong in this hospital anymore. And that's when the real nightmare began. The monitor flatlined at 2,147 hours. Code blue. Trauma Bay 4. The radio crackle scattered across the ER like gunfire. 23-year-old Navy SEAL, training accident, tension pneumothorax collapsing into cardiac arrest. ETA 2 minutes. Sarah was restocking the supply cart when the announcement came. She didn't move. Didn't pause. Muscle memory took over, hands already moving toward the trauma bay, already knowing what waited. The SEAL team trained at Naval Station Norfolk, 20 minutes down the interstate. Training accidents happened. Mostly they lived. Mostly. The stretcher burst through the double doors at 21:49, pushed by 2 paramedics with the focused intensity of people who'd been compressions for 5 minutes straight. The SEAL's chest was bare. His skin had the grey pallor of someone bleeding out internally. One paramedic was doing compressions, a young guy, maybe late 20s, sweat dripping off his chin into the open chest cavity. The other had a hand-operated ventilation bag, squeezing in a steady rhythm that looked almost meditative until you understood what it meant: no spontaneous breathing. No airway. Dead man walking. Dr. Mercer was already there, positioned at the head of the bay like he owned it, barking orders with the confidence of someone who'd never actually had to crack a chest when the clock was running out. Get a surgeon down here. Get me an ultrasound. Get me 2 units of O-negative ready. He was reading the paramedic report, his eyes moving across the paper with the lazy scan of someone who'd already decided the outcome. Tension pneumothorax. Collapse both lungs. How long has he been down? 6 minutes, the paramedic said. Needle decompression in the field didn't hold. He coded en route. Mercer nodded, still reading. Still moving slow. The SEAL had maybe 90 seconds before the brain damage became permanent. Maybe. The room had that strange quality of controlled chaos where everyone knew they were losing and nobody wanted to admit it. Respiratory therapy. 2 nurses. A resident. All of them waiting for the surgeon who wasn't here yet, wouldn't be here for 4 minutes, maybe 5. Sarah stepped to the bedside. No, Mercer said without looking up. I've got this. She didn't respond. She didn't argue. She just opened the instrument tray with her left hand and picked up the scalpel with her right. Hand steady as a surgical laser. Hands that had done this before in a desert on the other side of the world where the sky turned orange from dust and the screaming never stopped. The SEAL sternum was already exposed from the paramedic's emergency needle work. She could see the collapsed lung chambers. The blood pooling in the mediastinum. The heart that wasn't beating. Step back, she said. Not a question. The voice was different now, flat, even, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The voice of someone who'd made life and death decisions with 17-year-old Marines bleeding out in her lap. That's an order I'm giving. She cracked the sternum without hesitation. The rib spreader went in, opening the chest like a book, the bones making that soft creaking sound like a door that hadn't been opened in years. The room went dead silent. Even the monitors seemed to pause. The SEAL's heart was in her hands now, literally. She could see it, grey and still, surrounded by blood and fluid and the wreckage of a training gone wrong. Her fingers went in. For fingers on the anterior wall of the ventricle, the technique she'd learned in Korengal Valley, holding her best friend's heart while his body went cold in her arms. The 4-finger compression method that only worked if you had the anatomy memorized, if you understood the pressure, if you could feel the difference between what was living tissue and what was already dead. She began the massage. Not CPR compressions on a sternum. Direct cardiac massage. squeezing the actual organ in rhythm to the beat of her own pulse, a rhythm learned from thousands of hours in trauma in mountains where the helicopters couldn't fly and the only thing standing between dying and dead was hands that refused to stop. 75 compressions a minute. The rhythm her own heart had beaten for 23 years of running into fire instead of away from it. Her fingers felt the muscle respond, felt the subtle flutter as the rhythm caught, felt the organ remembering how to work. "Get me epi," she said. The voice wasn't hers anymore. It was the voice of the Master Chief. 1 milligram 4. Push it now. The resident moved. Everyone moved. Her hands continued the massage, the rhythm perfect, the pressure consistent, the entire physics of keeping a human being alive distilled into the precision of her fingers and muscle memory and the kind of focus that made everything else in the world disappear. O2 sat, she asked. Climbing, respiratory said. 68. 70. 72. The seal's skin was starting to pink up. The lungs were expanding on the ventilation. The monitor showed the first tentative electrical activity, a blip that could die out or could catch. Everything came down to the next 30 seconds. Blood pressure, she asked. Nil. Still nothing, the nurse said. She didn't stop. 80 compressions. 85. 90. The muscles in her forearm burning now, but that was information, not pain. Pain was just the body saying it was working. At 90 seconds, the monitor showed a change. A rhythm. A faint but legitimate electrical pattern. The kind of pattern that meant the heart was remembering. I've got a pulse, the nurse said. Her voice was shaking. Carotid pulse is back. It's back. Pulse is back. Sarah withdrew her hands. They were covered in blood up past the wrists, blood under her fingernails, blood soaked into her uniform, blood that had transferred from a dead man to a living one in 90 seconds of compressed cardiac massage. She stepped back from the table, and that's when she saw them. The three people who'd been watching the entire procedure. Clayton, the Army combat medic they'd pulled from the ED to assist. Rodriguez, the senior night shift surgical nurse. And Myers, the respiratory therapist, the one who'd trained under her for 6 months before being reassigned to pediatrics without explanation. They were all staring at her with the kind of look that comes when you see something impossible become real. Clayton's face had gone absolutely still. His mouth was slightly open. He was looking at her hands, at the blood, at the way she was standing, and she could see the moment recognition flashed across his features. Not recognition of her face. Recognition of technique. Recognition of the kind of mastery that only comes from doing the thing hundreds of times in circumstances where you couldn't afford to fail. Clayton had served in Bagram. He'd been there in 2011. He'd worked trauma medicine under fire. And there was only one person in the world who did the four-finger compression technique in exactly that way. Dr. Mercer was already moving. She could see it happening like watching a chess player realize he's being mated in 3 moves. He looked at Clayton's face. He looked at Rodriguez's face. He looked at Sarah standing covered in blood with the kind of composure that came from having done this before, having done this hundreds of times, having done this on operating tables that shook from artillery fire while people screamed for morphine that didn't exist. He grabbed the chart from Rodriguez's hands. He turned and walked out of the trauma bay without a word. His phone was already at his ear by the time he hit the hallway. She could hear his voice, low and urgent, dialing with the precision of someone who'd been planning his next move the entire time she was saving the SEAL's life. Not panic. Not anger. Just the clinical efficiency of a man who understood the game had changed and that the only way to win was to move first. But Sarah wasn't thinking about Dr. Mercer. She was looking at Clayton, and Clayton was looking at her with the kind of expression that meant he'd just realized exactly who he'd been working with for the past 3 weeks. His hands were shaking. Not from the crisis. From understanding. I need to get cleaned up, Sarah said to Rodriguez. His family is going to want updates. ICU should call them in the next 30 minutes. She walked past Clayton without making eye contact. She could feel his stare following her down the corridor, feel the weight of recognition, feel the moment when her carefully constructed invisibility had been shattered by a single medical procedure that only one person in the entire United States Navy knew how to execute. The bathroom was empty. Cold tile. Fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects. She ran the water as hot as she could stand it and scrubbed the blood from her hands, watching it spiral down the drain, red and then pink and then clear. Her uniform was destroyed. The scrubs would go in the red biohazard bin. But the blood under her fingernails, that would take longer. She dried her hands on a paper towel and touched the dog tag beneath her undershirt. Single dog tag on a broken chain, the one she'd kept for 5 years, the one that belonged to the friend who'd bled out in her arms in a valley whose name couldn't even be spoken in official briefings. The tag was warm from her body. She held it for exactly 4 seconds, then released it. When she stepped back into the hallway, there was a text on her phone from an unknown number. A single sentence. No signature. Conference room. 1600 Friday. Bring representation. She deleted it without saving it. She already knew what that meant. She already knew the board had been called. She already knew Dr. Mercer had moved, had done whatever brilliant administrative chess move he was going to do, had positioned himself to survive this the way he'd survived everything else in a life built on performance and lies. What he didn't know was that Clayton had seen. What he didn't know was that the Army medic in the trauma bay had just connected a phantom call sign to a living, breathing nurse who pushed a supply cart and worked the night shift and was currently the only person in St. Michael's who could do emergency cardiac massage like her life depended on it because her life had depended on it, every single day for nearly a decade in the mountains of Afghanistan. And that's when the real nightmare began. Dr. Mercer's hands were already moving before Sarah's gloves came off. The patient's chest still heaved with returning respiration, sinus rhythm climbing steady on the monitor behind them, 88, 92, 98, and Mercer was already at the nursing station, voice low and controlled, the kind of controlled that meant he'd been planning this moment since she first made him look small. He picked up the hospital phone. The nursing supervisor answered on the second ring. I need to report a critical incident. A nurse just performed an authorized thoracic surgery at the station without physician order, without consent, without any protocol whatsoever. Code status was full, but she cracked the chest anyway. Gross violation. I want it documented before she leaves the floor. His voice never crackled or rose. That was the terrifying part. He sounded reasonable. He sounded like a man protecting patients. Yes. Sarah Chen. Get the administrator. And get security briefed. I don't know what she'll do when she realizes what she's done. The receiver clicked. He hung up and turned to face the trauma bay, watching her through the glass partition as she checked the patient's pupils, her hands moving with that impossible precision, the kind of precision that came from doing this under mortar fire, under conditions that would break most people into fragments. She didn't know yet. Her focus was absolute. The patient was breathing. That was all that existed in her universe. But Mercer was already 17 moves ahead. Within the hour, he'd made phone calls. The 3 witnesses, Clayton the Army combat medic, the respiratory therapist who'd wheeled in the crash cart, the surgical resident who'd handed Sarah the scalpel, received new assignments. Email notifications. Effective immediately. Clayton got reassigned to day shift trauma intake, 12 hours and 30 minutes away from his current schedule. The respiratory therapist moved to ICU sedation protocol, nights, basement level, away from the ER where he might overhear conversations. The surgical resident transferred to orthopedic support, not a demotion exactly, just thoroughly separated from anyone who might corroborate the sequence of events. The administrative language was beautiful, scheduling optimization to balance unit census and staff expertise distribution. No one could prove it was retaliation. It was just reorganization. It was just efficiency. Sarah heard about the transfers when she clocked in at 2,200 that night. The night supervisor, a woman named Patricia who'd been kind to her for 3 years, read from a clipboard with apologetic eyes. Clayton's been moved to day trauma. Torres to ICU nights. Hawkins to orthopedics. When? Tonight. Already transitioned. Sarah nodded once and continued to the locker room. The dog tag pressed against her collarbone, still hidden beneath her scrubs where it had rested for 18 months. She dressed for her shift. She didn't call anyone. She didn't ask questions. She'd learned a long time ago that asking questions about military decisions was futile, even when those decisions were made by a man who couldn't tell the difference between a vascular clamp and a hemostat. The incident report appeared on her desk Friday morning. She read through it with the kind of calm that came from having read casualty reports written by people who weren't there, reports that missed the truth entirely but covered the author's back like armor. The narrative was clean. Professional. It documented Sarah's unauthorized intervention, her violation of scope of practice, her use of equipment without proper ordering chain. But it omitted something critical, the patient's code status. It never mentioned that the SEAL had been declared full code by the attending emergency physician, that resuscitation was the only legally defensible option. Without that sentence, the report read like Sarah had performed major surgery on a patient who wasn't meant to be saved, who should have been allowed to die quietly. It was a lie so careful that you couldn't quite call it a lie. It was just selective silence. That Friday morning, before 0800, Mercer's brother, a healthcare attorney with an office in a building with valet parking, sent a formal letter to hospital legal. The letter alleged gross negligence, practicing beyond scope of licensure, lack of proper credentialing for thoracic intervention, and breach of patient autonomy. It requested immediate termination of employment. Attached was a one-page summary of incidents, the chest crack, concerning patterns of medication access, and something about fitness for duty questions. By 1000, Sarah's access to the medical record system was revoked. She logged in to pull a patient chart and hit a wall. Red text, access denied. Below it, a case number and instruction to contact HR immediately. She didn't contact HR. She knew what was coming. The conference room was on the 3rd floor. Grey walls. A long table. The hospital administrator, a woman named Diane Cho who'd hired Sarah 18 months ago and never once asked where she came from, sat at the head of the table. Mercer was beside her, fingers steepled, looking like a man about to regret having to fire someone, which was his best performance yet. Sarah. Thank you for coming up. Sarah Saturday. The room smelled like industrial coffee and the kind of fear that comes from knowing you can't fight this alone. Diane opened a folder. Inside was the incident report, the legal letter, a short stack of documents Sarah recognized as her employment contract. Her voice was careful, the voice of someone reading words that had been vetted by lawyers. We've completed our review of Tuesday night's incident in the trauma bay. The hospital has determined that your actions constituted unauthorized practice of medicine, violation of your nursing licensure scope, and failure to follow established protocols during a critical patient event. Given the severity and the liability concerns raised by our legal team, we've made the decision to terminate your employment effective immediately. Sarah opened her mouth. Her hand moved forward, not a tremor, just a reaching motion, like she was about to show them something, explain something, make them understand that the patient had been coding, that 90 seconds had saved a life, that the code status had been active and full and everything by the book if anyone bothered to read the actual book instead of the version Mercer had written. Mercer smiled. Not warmly. The smile of a man who was done with her. Your access is revoked. Please surrender your badge and any hospital property. Security is here to assist with the transition. She heard the word assist and understood it for what it was, the velvet over the knife. Sarah reached up and unclipped her badge. The weight of it leaving her chest was strange, 3 pounds of plastic and credential that had somehow become part of her body. She set it on the table. It landed with a soft click. I can explain. There's nothing to explain, Mercer said, still smiling. Your actions speak for themselves. HR will mail your final paycheck within 5 business days. 2 security officers appeared at the door. Not there to hurt her. Just there to make sure she left. The kind of presence that turns a firing into an escorting, a humiliation into protocol. Sarah stood. She didn't argue. She'd learned that lesson in uniform. Arguing in front of an audience just gave them more material, more justification, more reasons to feel right about what they were doing. The locker room was empty at 16:45. She opened her locker and looked at what 18 months had accumulated. 2 spare pairs of compression socks. A personal medication kit she'd never used. A bottle of lotion that smelled like lavender and nothing like the antiseptic walls of a field hospital. And at the bottom, the items she'd kept invisible, the mug from a SEAL Team 3 retirement ceremony, chipped on one side, the words "World's Okayest Nurse" printed in fading letters. A succulent that had stopped growing 3 months ago, the leaves papery and brittle. A photograph in a clear plastic sleeve, her spotter, Rodriguez, 23 years old, with that smile that came from being alive when being alive was a miracle. And wrapped carefully beneath all of it, a dog tag on a broken chain. Her dog tag. The one she'd lost in Sanjin Valley. The one that should have been buried with Rodriguez. She packed them into a cardboard box from the storage closet. She didn't look around. There was nothing here that belonged to her. The bus stop was 6 blocks away. Rain had been falling since afternoon, the kind of rain that looked like it had nowhere else to go, like it would fall until the world remembered why water was dangerous. Sarah sat on the bench with the box on her lap. Her scrubs were soaked. Her hair dripped. Around her, the city continued, cars hissing past on wet asphalt, people hurrying toward shelter, the ordinary world spinning on without pausing for anyone's ruin. She opened the box and looked at the photograph. Rodriguez's smile. That was what she remembered most vividly, not the moment he died, but the moment before, when they were pinned down behind a wall and he'd looked at her and said something stupid, something about getting ice cream when they got back to base, and she'd laughed, actually laughed, and for 3 seconds the war had felt like it was happening to someone else. She closed her eyes. One tear escaped. Just one. She wiped it away with the back of her hand and felt nothing. The dog tag pressed against her thigh through the cardboard. Still hidden. Still secret. Still hers alone. The bus was 2 minutes late. She boarded and took a seat by the window. The rain hammered against the glass like something trying to get in. In 3 days, a Taliban logistics officer would arrive at St. Michael's emergency department, bleeding slowly from an inflamed appendix, and would recognize her voice when she checked his vitals. In 3 days, her entire world would change again. But that night, sitting on a bus with a cardboard box containing everything she'd tried to leave behind, Sarah Chen was invisible again, just another person trying to get home, just another story that nobody would ever tell. 3 days later, the Taliban logistics officer arrived at St. Michael's ER with acute appendicitis, and the moment he saw Sarah covering a friend's shift for rent money, his face went pale. He whispered in Pashto, the words barely audible across the triage desk, "Nightingale, the American angel who killed half my unit and then saved my brother's life." Sarah's hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply moved to the next patient chart as if he hadn't spoken, as if his trembling recognition meant nothing, as if the call sign buried under 5 years of scrubs and silence hadn't just surfaced in a waiting room full of strangers. A Marine Corps colonel was in the lobby waiting for his daughter's x-rays when he heard the name whispered in broken English. He'd spent 23 years around operators, he knew the sound of fear mixed with reverence. He pulled Sarah's personnel file using his hospital administrator access before she'd even admitted the Afghan patient. Then he read aloud in the lobby, his voice steady as a funeral bell, Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, Navy Cross for running through enemy fire to extract 3 wounded SEALs. Silver Star for holding a field hospital alone against insurgent assault for 9 hours. Each sentence dropped like a stone into still water. A nurse froze mid-stride. 2 residents stopped walking. The colonel continued, Purple Heart. Purple Heart again. Promoted to Master Chief at age 31. Sarah was prepping the appendicitis patient in Bay 3 when the hospital administrator rushed in and grabbed her arm. "My office. Now." The administrator's hands were shaking, her hands, not Sarah's. In the office, the administrator pointed to the phone on speaker. The Pentagon. Public Affairs Office. They want to talk to you about a statement Dr. Mercer just made on Channel 7 News. Sarah's breathing didn't change. She sat down. The Pentagon's voice came through the speaker, clinical and measured. "We have someone on standby if you need representation, Master Chief." That afternoon, Dr. Mercer had appeared on the 4 p.m. news cycle with rehearsed smug carefully arranged across his face. He'd called in every favor, every connection the station manager owed him for a medical consultation that had saved the station from a malpractice suit 3 years back. The anchor gave him the softball setup. "Dr. Mercer, this woman was fired from your hospital for violating basic protocol. Can you comment?" Mercer smiled like a wolf showing teeth. "She's a liar and a fraud. No military record, no medals, no clearance. Just a night shift nurse playing soldier to cover her incompetence." He leaned back. "The public deserves to know who's actually treating them." 30 seconds into his smug tirade, the phone lines lit up. The anchor's producer screamed in his earpiece. The anchor's face changed, not dramatically, but completely. "We have a retired vice admiral on the line." The color drained from Mercer's face. The vice admiral's voice came through the speaker like a tank idling in a garage, measured, powerful, utterly lethal. "Dr. Mercer, I'm looking at your resume right now. You claim to have served as a battalion surgeon in Iraq for 14 months. Navy records show you washed out of officer candidate school in week 2. Failing the physical fitness test." Silence. The kind of silence that broadcasts to 2 million viewers. Meanwhile, the woman you just slandered has a code name so classified I needed 4 security clearances to say it on national television. "She saved my son's life in Korengal Valley. He was bleeding out from a femoral artery wound. She applied a tourniquet while rounds were still impacting around her position. My son is alive because of her. You aren't even a real officer." The interview cut to commercial. Mercer's face had gone the color of hospital walls. Within 2 hours, the hospital board convened an emergency meeting. His attorney brother called in every marker, every favor from every firm they'd built capital with over 2 decades. It didn't matter. The 3 witnesses that Mercer had reassigned suddenly found their voices, all of them, together, filing statements about the retaliation tactics, the reassignments, the threat delivered in the supply closet. The altered incident report was forensically reviewed. The SEAL, the one Mercer had tried to claim responsibility for saving, held a press conference at Walter Reed. His voice carried the specific weight of someone who'd been dead and returned. "I was in cardiac arrest. My heart wasn't beating. Dr. Mercer wasn't even in the building. This woman cracked my chest and brought me back with her hands. Literal hands on my heart. She's the surgeon here. He's a paper tiger." Social media erupted like mortar fire. Within 12 hours, 3 different investigative journalists had confirmed Mercer's falsified resume. He'd also lied about completing residency at Johns Hopkins, had never actually completed a fellowship, had purchased his credentials from a diploma mill in 2008. His malpractice insurance dropped him that evening. St. Michael's Hospital Board fired him by end of business, effective immediately, with cause, which meant no severance, no settlement, no insurance protection. The state medical board suspended his license pending investigation. His attorney brother couldn't save him. Nobody could. Within 6 months, Dr. Mercer was working urgent care in a strip mall between a vape shop and a tax preparation office on the outskirts of Virginia Beach, seeing sore throats and STD tests, his hands trembling while he examined patients who had no idea who they were being treated by. His former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him. The hospital had listed his departure as pursuing other opportunities. No one had said a word, which meant everyone knew everything. Sarah stood in her rebuilt navy dress whites at a Pentagon ceremony 6 months after the fire. The dress uniform hung on her frame like memory made tangible, the blue trousers with their precise crease, the white jacket tailored to perfection, the rank insignia gleaming at her shoulders, Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy. The single dog tag she'd carried in that cardboard box, the one that had survived 5 years of hiding, had been polished to mirror-bright perfection. It hung from a new chain, heavy and real, catching the light as she moved through the ceremony room. The seal she'd saved was there, whole and alive, his own family beside him, wife, 2 daughters, his mother weeping quietly into a tissue. He stepped forward when they called her name. He didn't shake her hand. He knelt, took her hand between both of his, and said the word she'd needed to hear for 5 years, his voice thick with 5 years of gratitude. "Welcome home, Master Chief." The room erupted. Veterans stood. Active duty officers stood. Nurses stood. The Vice Admiral pinned a commendation to her chest, called it the finest emergency medicine he'd witnessed in 40 years of service. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of genuine respect. "You never left the fight. You just found a different battlefield." St. Michael's Hospital flew her back for a formal apology delivered by the board chair in the same conference room where Mercer had fired her. They offered her the position of Director of Emergency Medicine, triple her old salary, full benefits, a research budget. Sarah accepted on one condition, a scholarship fund for combat medics transitioning to civilian nursing. The Army medic who'd recognized her vascular technique, Clayton, the one who'd seen her impossible 4-finger clamp in Bagram, was the first recipient. He'd wept when the notification came through. He'd never seen her identified. He'd kept the secret perfectly. And then she chose to honor him with his name engraved on the scholarship certificate. The Afghan patient whose brother she'd saved in Korengal sent a letter through refugee services, smuggled through 6 countries, his words translated into English by a volunteer. "You were mercy in the valley of death. My brother lives because you lived." The world does not know this. But we do. We will never forget. Sarah kept that letter in her office drawer, beside the cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," beside the succulent plant that had somehow survived on a rain-soaked bus stop and was now thriving on her office windowsill, blooming impossible green. The 3 witnesses who'd been reassigned got promotions. St. Michael's named them as co-leads on a new trauma protocols task force. Their statements had been the domino that brought Mercer down. They'd chosen integrity over comfort, and the institution had finally recognized the cost of speaking truth. One of them, the junior resident who'd nearly lost her job for supporting Sarah, was now an attending physician, mentoring the next generation in both medicine and courage. Dr. Mercer sent one email to Sarah 3 weeks after his license suspension was finalized. It read like something his lawyer had dictated: "I apologize for any misunderstandings. I hope you can move forward." Sarah read it once. She deleted it without responding. The silence was louder than any words could have been. At the closing ceremony of the new veteran transition program at St. Michael's, Sarah addressed a room of 47 combat medics, corpsmen, and field surgeons moving into civilian medicine. They sat in perfect attention, the way only warriors can sit, spine straight, eyes forward, ready. Sarah wore her dress whites. Her voice, when she spoke, had dropped an octave since her first shift in this hospital. It was command voice, not request voice. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Most of our greatest acts happen in the dark. Nobody films it. Nobody writes about it. Nobody knows. We do it anyway, because the person in front of us matters more than the recognition we'll never receive. Some of you are going to hide like I did. I understand. I did it for 5 years. But if you find the courage, step into the light. There are people who need to know that warriors can heal. That strength isn't weakness. That the hands that held rifles can hold stethoscopes and save just as many lives. The SEAL who'd been in cardiac arrest stood in the front row. He was studying nursing now, at Sarah's recommendation. His oldest daughter sat beside him, writing furiously in a notebook. She wanted to be a trauma surgeon, he told Sarah privately, because she wanted to be strong like her mother, but also because she'd seen what real strength looked like, a woman with scarred hands who'd chosen medicine over medals. Sarah's hands, still scarred from Korengal Valley, from training incidents, from 5 years of emergency medicine, finally stopped shaking when she slept. She'd moved back into a small apartment in Norfolk, 2 blocks from the water, where she could hear the Atlantic at night and remember that some things were bigger than any one person's pain. The dog tag hung on her bedside table now, catching light, the reminder that she'd stopped hiding. That the world had finally seen her. That the cost of staying silent was sometimes higher than the cost of being found. Have you ever worked somewhere that didn't see who you really were? If you're a veteran in healthcare or any field and you're still hiding, I want you to know that your story matters. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes among us, the ones whose strength has been invisible for too long. Like this video if Sarah's journey resonates with you. Comment below, what would you do if the world finally saw your truth? And share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone in their fight.